the talk that I'm going to give today is from a book that I just recently published, which is called Stereophonica, Sound and Space in Science, Technology, and the Arts. And what this is, it's a study, it's a historical study of different concepts of auditory and acoustic spatiality from mostly from the early 19th century to the present day. And I cover a lot of different topics. The talk that I'm going to give today is from a chapter which is on acoustic defense during the Second World War. And after that, I try to link that to things that were happening in industry, audio industry, for example, in stereo reproduction of sound. And that really came out of the wartime research. So without further ado, this is a little intro now to that chapter. So we're probably all familiar with the concept of monaural and binaural audition, so hearing with one or two ears. But this was not always the case. That idea of binaural audition wasn't always in circulation. For many centuries, hearing was studied as a one-eared phenomenon, and it was the anatomy and the physiology of the single ear that was under scrutiny in Western science and medicine. The person who coined the term binaural was a British physician called Scott Somerville Allison, who invented this device, which he called the differential stethoscope in 1858. And as you can see, it has, it's a binaural stethoscope in that it has the two earpieces, but it also has two kind of collecting cups for the sound. And he coined that term binaural in discussing this device. And that term binaural audition then started to become associated with a spatial sense of hearing, so sensing the location and the distance and the direction of sounds. The person who coined the term stereophonic was actually Alexander Graham Bell, who conducted, after he had was one of the inventors of the telephone, conducted a series of quite extensive experiments to try to determine whether one could hear where sounds were coming from when you listen through the telephone, or hear how far away sounds are when you listen through the telephone. Of course, it was a new technology, so they wanted to study that phenomenon. So of course they said you can't actually tell where sounds are coming from, just as today we can't tell. But as you can see, he's holding two telephone receivers to his ears, and so they were actually experimenting with a kind of stereo mode of reproduction through telephonic listening as well. And what he said was there seems to be a one-sidedness about sounds received through a single ear, as there is about objects perceived by one eye. But when both ears are employed simultaneously, sounds assume a solidity, which was not perceptible so long as one ear was employed. And so that word stereo, it comes from the Greek, ancient Greek stereos. I know we have a Greek speaker in the room. I've seen Marianthi, so maybe you can correct my pronunciation, Marianthi, if that's wrong. But what that term means is solid. So that's where that comes from, this idea of kind of something, a solid sound, something with dimensionality. And what he observed when listening through the telephone with two telephone receivers was what he likened to a stereoscopic effect of audition. And there he was referring to Charles Wheatstone's stereoscope, which was a very popular device for image reproduction or image viewing in the 19th century. Basically, it was a device where when you viewed, when you looked through the stereoscope, you would look at two images, but see them as a single three-dimensional image. So the stereoscope, and what he was thinking was a kind of stereoscopic effect, but in hearing. And he said, you know, that one day he predicted that his telephone would be used to produce stereophonic phenomena of binaural audition. And he was correct, because in the very next year, a French engineer called Clément Ader created this device, which became known as the théâtrophone. And what it was the first stereo broadcasting system, and it used the Bell telephone to broadcast opera, theater, and music from different auditoriums to either people's homes or else to these public teatrophone machines. And as you can see, she in this poster is also listening to two receivers. So they were holding two receivers to their ears and they were listening in stereo. And so then journalists were trying to kind of talk about, what is this phenomenon of this kind of three-dimensional spatial sound that we're hearing through the teatrophone, and started to describe something called auditory perspective. Here is another version of the teatrophone. This is the woman who is on the cover of my book, which I was really delighted that ended up being on the cover. She is this was taken in 1901, even though she looks like a kind of contemporary, kind of cool hipster, basically. But so she's actually listening to an English version of this, which was called the electrophone. But it was the same principle as the teatrophone. It transmitted sound from multiple telephone transmitters to two receivers. Now, people started then to examine in a more systematic way how is auditory space perception working. And this was an important series of experiments conducted by a guy called Hugo Munsterberg and Arthur Henry Pierce at the Harvard Psychological Laboratory in the late 1800s. And what they were doing was putting people inside this kind of cage-like device where they had put telephone receivers onto that, and they were moving them around and the auditor would try to guess the direction in which the sound was coming from while they were blindfolded. Now, what Arthur Henry Pierce writes in his very influential book, Studies in Auditory and Visual Space Perception, was that one cannot suppress an exclamation of surprise at finding so widespread a denial to hearing of all independent participation in a world of space. So at this time, they were talking about things like visual space, tactual space, the space of touch, but actually they were saying that auditory space perception either didn't exist, many psychologists believed that, or that it was kind of inferior, subordinate, secondary to visual space perception. And what he did to prove that auditory space perception did exist independently of vision or touch was some of those auditors, they would hear a sound located inside the space of their cranium, so the space inside their own head. And so if you can sense a sound as being located inside your head, you can't see inside that space and you can't touch or feel inside that space. So that was the theory that they used to prove that auditory space perception was an independent perceptual faculty. But they said at the same time, he wrote, hearing serves vision, because if one were to try to locate oneself in space only through hearing, it would be like finding oneself in a hall of mirrors, because sounds are always being reflected. So he said one would never know whither to turn. So that's the kind of prelude to where we arrive, which is that this all starts to change during the First World War, when you have these new technologies of warfare, airplanes on the horizon for the first time. So this is a account from 1922 by a British physiologist called A.V. Hill, who ran a unit that was trying to do this kind of auditory space perception for military purposes. And what he said was the necessity for sound locators arose when night bombing by aircraft first became a serious menace. It became imperative to devise means first of locating and then attacking raiding aircraft. Now, the idea of tracking the enemy by listening to it might be obvious to us today, and of course we have things like sonar, but that wasn't actually obvious in 1914. This is another British account. This person writes, our enemies were seeking safety for their attack principally by rendering their airships as far as possible invisible by taking advantage of the protection of clouds. The main problem, therefore, which presented itself to the gun's defense was how were we to effectively hit an object which we could not see? The answer is childishly simple, namely that though we can't see it, yet we can hear it. Therefore, as we cannot aim by using our eyes, we shall be obliged to shoot by using our ears to aim with. And then what he says is, this kind of idea, it seems extremely simple when you know it, but there was a long way to go before theory could be turned into practice. So what I'm going to explore in the talk is how theory was turned into practice through the use of these kinds of devices like sound locators. And I'm focusing specifically on acoustic sound locators, things that required human auditors to listen. And so I'm looking in this chapter at the birth of what we call acoustic defense, so tracking the enemy through sound. And I'm interested in these three national contexts, Britain, France, and the United States. There are others who have explored the German acoustic defense and Italian acoustic defense projects. And what I'm interested in is both the technologies of listening that were part of this project, as well as the kinds of new modes of listening that they inspired. And also then, why was acoustic defense important for our understanding of sound and audition? So here's another account. This is from the American Secretary of War, Benedict Crowell, and he's writing this right after the war. He commissions this massive report on America's munitions, in which they write, "In childhood, we were enthralled by the tales of those magic persons whose keen hearing could detect even the whisper of the growing grass. As camouflage developed, modern warfare yearned for such supernatural gifts of sense that troops might detect the unseen presence of the enemy. Accordingly, science, the fairy godmother of today's soldiers, raised her wand, and lo, the army was equipped with the wonderful ears of the fairy tale, uncanny no longer, but a concrete manufacturing proposition." Now that sounds a bit fantastical, but actually it wasn't entirely an exaggeration, because scientific experimentation grew exponentially during the war, scientific experimentation in sound and audition, whereas 19th century acoustics studies were relatively small, occasional, done by individual scientists in their laboratories in different parts of the world. During the First World War, there were thousands of experiments. They were very generously resourced and funded. And there was the urgency, of course, of the war. And there was communication happening at the national as well as international level. So the Allied forces did communicate quite a lot about acoustics. In France, acoustic defense came under the purview of this military body. I'm not going to bother massacring those French words. And it was run by General Gustave Auguste Ferrier, who's still a very well-known scientist, a kind of legendary scientist, as well as a military leader in France. And the French project included, they invited quite a few now very well-known physicists and astronomers and other kinds of scientists to take part in this project. So this is a famous one. Rene Bio, he was an astronomer and physicist, and he created this really interesting device I'll talk about in a moment, called the Bio Paraboloid. He was an astronomer when the war started, so that's where he was coming from. But and actually I should say a lot of where I got some of the images that you're going to see are from his memoirs. So not all of this material was of course published, and certainly not during the war, since it was highly classified information. But after the war, you do find some scientists publishing these things in scientific writings. In France, there was also Jean-Baptiste Perrin, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and he invented this device, which I'll also introduce, which is called the Perrin télécitémètre. And in the United States, acoustic defense came under the purview of the Signal Corps. Now, the Signal Corps was established during the Civil War, the US Civil War. But during the First World War, at the start of it, it was a very small division. There were only 11 officers and 10 soldiers, but this was the division in charge of military communications. So that's obviously too small. And the person who then was in charge of the Signal Corps was somebody whose name might be familiar to you, George Owen Squire. And I say that because he ended up becoming the inventor of Muzak after the war. And I look at that in my book as well, to kind of track the links between acoustic defense and then Muzak, and then what happens later in the Second World War, which is more like sonic warfare. So he was the chief signal officer of the Signal Corps, and he wrote to US industry leaders and asked them to basically support this effort. And in only 1 year after that, the Signal Corps Reserve had grown to this size. There were 53,000 men in the reserve of the Signal Corps, and many of them were engineers from places like AT&T and Western Electric. And then finally, in England, acoustic defense was under the purview of these different military units: the Munitions Inventions Department, which ran the Anti-Aircraft Experimental Section, as well as the Air Inventions Board, where there was the Acoustical Research Section. Now, I went to the Science Museum, which there's the one in London, but they also have a place in Rotten, which is a massive kind of site where they store these kinds of old technologies. And they also have declassified military reports and communications from this period. So that was a kind of big find for me when I went there. So I was looking at these MID reports, and in them you find many different acoustic technologies that are under discussion, including tube resonators, Helmholtz resonators, these things which I'll talk about, which are sound locating trumpets. These kind of interesting devices called listening wells, that's the image that you're seeing there. And what they were doing was putting these two massive listening discs and trying to focus sound through them. And then a lot on this kind of thing, what we would now maybe think of as a kind of predecessor of the sound mirrors. So this is a kind of paraboloid, but what I want to show here is that over just about a year-long period, you really see how it develops. So this is Rene Bio. He's the one on the left, and he's using a kind of stethoscope to listen to sound, which is being focused at the center of this parabolic dish. He, of course, is an astronomer, and he was thinking actually of the Newtonian telescope and the concave lenses of the telescope, and thinking about, how do you track an object from far away? And so he transposed that kind of principle into the acoustic domain and was looking then at this kind of dish. But this size, let's say, was too small. It couldn't reflect those kind of long wavelengths, the low wavelengths of the Gotha aircraft that they were trying to shoot down. So this became larger. They also had then not one but two auditors. You can see that he's using there a hand wheel to rotate it. There are then here two people who are listening. One is listening to the altitude, and the other is listening to the horizontal bearings of the aircraft. And I don't know if you can kind of make this thing out. It's an automatic course plotter, which they're also using to show the trajectory of the aircraft that they're tracking. So it would actually produce these kind of visual designs, charts of those aircraft trajectories. There's another bioparaboloid. Here we can see, again, it's still in development. This is a different model then for the dish. It's changed size and shape. Here's an American model, the American paraboloid type acoustic detector. You can already, just by looking at it, see that it's lighter materials, and that is because, they need this to be kind of practicable and portable. So more practicable for warfare. And here's another one of the American type. So the reason I wanted to show this was to show how quickly these technologies developed. This is in a just 1 year period. So there was a really rapid kind of development in all of these kinds of design modifications, as well as, the different national contexts are kind of improving on each other's designs and sharing information about them. Now I want to go to one of the maybe first acoustic defense technologies of the First World War. This is called a geophone. And what it was, you could see kind of already that it has a kind of antecedent. It looks a little bit like that differential stethoscope that we saw of Somerville Scott Allison's. But it's like that differential stethoscope, but they're not listening cups. Those listening cups of the stethoscope have been replaced by these seismographs. What the geophone was, it was a subterranean instrument, And so the listener would put those two seismographs onto the floors or the walls of a subterranean chamber, and they would transduce vibrations of the earth into sound. Someone who was trained to listen through the geophone could discriminate between different kinds of sounds, as well as how those sounds were modified by different kinds of terrain. So they could detect movement up to 100 feet, and they could also tell the direction in which it was coming from. So this was a kind of simple, maybe device, but it was so effective that it basically made mining operations obsolete very quickly. Because if you can tell where they're doing those operations, you can quickly, I guess, try to get them, shoot them out. There's another, so this is using something called the binaural principle. There's another kind of physical principle at work in some of these acoustic defense technologies. This one is using interaural time difference. So the time difference in when the phase of sound is hitting either of the ears. And this is based on another, this is a 19th century device called the topophone. And as you can see, what it's kind of doing is it's almost extending that distance between the two ears. It's almost like your ears are now located here and here. So that increases interaural time difference, and it makes it more possible then to tell direction. And that is then mapped out onto these two World War I devices, the Wertbostel, which was a German device, and the Claude orthophone, which was a French device. That same principle then is underlying these objects, which are the double trumpet sound locators. Now, these are using conical horns or listening trumpets, and in order to determine the direction, the listener would equalize the sound at the two ears, so until it sounds like it's at the same amplitude. And that was a process called bracketing the sound. And I don't know if you can tell, but there's one listener here, but then there's another listener here. So there's two people who are listening. One is listening to those two horns, and one is listening to those two horns. So one of those pairs of horns is being used to determine the direction of the sound along the horizontal plane, or the azimuth, and the other pair was used to determine the elevation or the altitude of the sound. So this is what was called an alt-azimuth mounting. And I just want to show a video now of one of these devices in action. This is actually during the interwar period. This is an American group of soldiers who are doing kind of preparatory exercise. This is in Virginia, I believe, being filmed in 1938. But even already you can see from the film, it's a very heavy kind of device. It's quite laborious to maneuver. There's maybe, I think, 6 or so men who are needed to get that thing off the thing and put it on the thing with wheels, which they called a turntable, actually. But then you can see how they're able to rotate it. And then this is the searchlight. So once they had the double trumpet locator in place, they were listening to the sound of the aircraft, and then they would use these powerful searchlights to point at where they thought the airplane was, and then of course they would try to shoot down that airplane. So military auditors, they were listening in very adverse conditions. Of course, it was dark. They were listening at night. It was during this very chaotic, period of warfare. And we know that the soundscape of the war was very extreme. So there were reports of things like instantaneous deafness, ear trauma, as well as listener fatigue, which they started to study then. How quickly would people tire when listening through these devices? And they found actually quite quickly their acoustic aimings would not work. So here, in order then to protect different cities, they started to set up these kinds of écoles d'écoute, what they called schools of hearing. This was in France, and they were set up kind of in French towns near Paris, because of course it was most important to protect the French capital. And so there were a few of these écoles d'écoute, and here you can see they're also acting as kind of reservoirs for these big technologies. We also find then, this is a French manual that's been translated into English, that they're training these military auditors at these écoles d'écoute. So there's a manual on training of sound observers for this device, which was called an acoustic goniometer, and you can see that it's kind of like the double trumpet sound locator, but it's just these smaller and horns that are clustered together. And what they would do is they would do these kind of listening exercises in 5 stages. In the first stage, the person who is making the sound wouldn't move. They would clap or use a trumpet. And then they would move sideways and the auditor would adjust. Now, if that auditor couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, they were out, basically. It was a like weeding out exercise because they were trying to find people who could do this well. And then they would start to mimic a moving sound source. And then the auditor would follow the sound of an airplane, and then 2 auditors would do it together. So it was kind of a systematic training of those military auditors. And you can then infer that directional listening starts to become understood as a skill. And they wrote that those auditors should be trained every day systematically, otherwise they would quickly lose their efficiency. So then the last device that I'll introduce, it's this quite beautiful, and it was the mechanically most complex maybe device of the First World War. It was called the Perrin télécitomètre. And his question really was, how can you increase the amplification of those conical horns, but not the size of the instrument? And he came up with this solution, which was to cluster together these smaller horns, these elementary horns, in these honeycomb-like patterns, what he called these multicellular horn assemblages, which he named Myriaphones. So that's what this thing is called, the Myriaphone. And this device actually became, and then at first they only have 2, and then again they do the thing where they have it going in both directions. So this device was adopted as standard by the French, and it was used very extensively toward the end of the war. They also used it again to do those kind of image plottings where they were tracking the aircraft trajectories. So they would create these kind of acoustic charts that would show that. So just to wrap up, why was acoustic defense important? Well, certainly it gave a practical military advantage to the, military forces that were good at doing this. But it also really furthered acoustic and auditory science, and to my mind also reconfigured how we think of listening, as well as kind of maybe more fundamental conceptions of sound. So there was a disciplining of the listener that happened during this time. You had, for the first time really in human history, the rise of this kind of expert listener who was the military auditor, who was not only maybe disciplined but militarized. As we saw, the active listening then also changes. Whereas we think of listening normally in everyday context as this, simple thing that individuals are carrying out, it's really becomes a quite complex and a fragmented act, which is carried out by groups of people who perform different parts of that listening act. There's also an underlying model here of listening as data collection. The auditors are continuously reporting acoustic data. So the military auditor during this period is almost acting as a human acoustic sensor. Of course, they don't have computers. If they did, they would use those. But this is before that. But it's almost like that idea of machine listening, but before they had the technological capability of doing that. These technologies also inspired the new modes of listening. For example, that double binaural mode of listening, or that alt-azimuth listening. And they were inspiring new cooperative and collaborative forms of listening, since they eventually, to really use these in warfare, they required teams of people who were being coordinated between the searchlight team and the sound locator team and the auditors and the people who were making the charts and reporting that data. Further, listening was not always used in the sense of hearing sound. but there were also different forms of acoustic sensing. So I didn't show some of those technologies, but they were also doing things with just visual imaging of sound waves during this time. So this was a kind of furthering this idea that sound is not only something you can hear, but something you can sense. It makes that idea that I write that acoustic defense made acoustic energy audible, those kind of energies that might not be as audible without these technologies, and also through imaging techniques visible in a new way. It also changed the definition of sound, whereas at the outset of the war, sound was most often defined as, quote, the effect produced upon the auditory nerve by certain vibratory motions. So basically that's the kind of the listening. During the war, that definition wasn't always applicable. And as A.B. Hill wrote, we must also consider the propagation of sound without reference to its ultimate detection by the ear. So that then furthers this definition of sound as a vibratory motion of matter of the type to which the organ of hearing responds. So there's a kind of important conceptual shift there. So here, sound is not only understood as the effect upon the ear, but as sensible energy. And in conclusion, before the war, auditory space was really thought of as a kind of secondary space, one that was subordinate to visual space. But during the First World War, it emerged as a vital space, a space that was surveilled and scrutinized to an extraordinary degree. And what I say in my chapter is that during this time, powers of hearing became mapped out onto the actual powers of nation states. And whereas directional listening during the 19th century was almost exclusively studied in terms of human physiology and psychology, during this period it becomes understood in strategic terms, really first and foremost as a tactical activity, when that could determine human as well as national survival. Acoustic defense also concretized this common refrain we have that sound travels. And what it did was it showed that, by orienting oneself to the path of sound, that one could potentially even orient history itself. So thank you so much for listening. That's the talk, and yeah, and then this is the book if anyone is interested in kind of going into it.